Professor Livingston first approached me about presenting a paper on Southern literature at the summer session, I was very excited and thrilled, but I have to admit that those emotions were vying with emotions of desperation and exhaustion that were occurring in the last couple weeks of my first year of graduate studies. So I told him I would love to, but I need a little time to think about my topic. And he said, "Oh, that's fine. You do what you need to do, darling." And when he called back, I had to say, frankly, I haven't thought much about this beyond why I even study Southern literature. And I thought that was room for me to take some more time to think of my title. But as you see on your program this evening, he was confident that I would have the answer to that question this evening. Why you should study Southern literature. So that is what I'm going to attempt to do this evening. But I think that the best way to approach the question is actually with an earlier question, and that is why we study literature at all, why we read, why man writes. There's a French philosopher that I studied this previous semester named Paul Ricoeur, and Paul Ricoeur built on the philosophy of Heidegger and Husserl and some other German philosophers with too many consonants and not enough vowels in their last names to build a semiotic theory called phenomenological hermeneutics. And I will admit that I struggled mightily with his writing, but I am confident that I came out with at least two concrete things out of that class. And one of them was that I now know how to spell phenomenological hermeneutics, and I know the power that it has to ward off unwanted conversations. And the other is his narrative theory. I think it's a very powerful and accurate way to understand why men write. Paul Ricoeur explains how poetic discourse creates a world for man that transcends reality. And when he talks about poetic discourse, he doesn't mean just poetry, just verse, but any type of text that is an art form. So pretty much everything excepting your laundry list, which he would consider practical discourse. So he thinks that the text creates a world beyond itself in which man can make sense of his reality. It's a way to understand why we are in the world and our human nature in relation to reality. And I think that is clear to see if you consider history. From the beginning of time, from Greek mythology, we see men telling stories and writing stories to explain some aspect of nature. I think of the story of Phaethon, and I'm probably mispronouncing that because I was a Latin scholar and not a Greek scholar, and Helios. Phaethon was the son, S-O-N, of the sun, S-U-N, God, and he asked his father if he could drive the chariot that carried the sun across the sky with the horses, and he begged him until he finally received permission, and then the horses went out of control and went all over the sky, and they came down to earth and they burned the fields. And I just think that that's a really beautiful way to explain something that otherwise mankind would have to say happened by chance. How can we explain suffering, or how can we have reasons for suffering? We create stories to explain these things. The transcendental, the supernatural, as children, we come to understand those things not through reading Thomas Aquinas, not even usually through reading the Bible. The first encounter that you have with the supernatural is usually through fairy tales. My first encounter with the nature of the devil and temptation was from the Disney movie Snow White, where the old witch holds the apple to Snow White and asks her to eat it. Jesus taught in parables. Man tells stories because he has to make sense of his being in the world. If everything else is taken from man, he will still be telling these stories. And Faulkner puts that so well in his Nobel Prize Peace acceptance speech. Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech. Not a peace prize, literature prize. You get the idea. He says, when the last ding-dong of doom has clanged and faded from the last worthless rock hanging tideless in the last red and dying evening, even then there will still be one sound, that of man's puny, inexhaustible voice still talking. Man is always going to tell stories. But if all stories are a way to redescribe our reality, then how do we distinguish between good stories and bad stories? What sets one story apart from another? It is because we can tell which stories are more honest to our human nature. Flannery O'Connor writes that the serious writer has always taken the flaw in human nature for his starting point, usually the flaw in an otherwise admirable character. Drama usually bases itself on the bedrock of original sin, whether the writer thinks in theological terms or not. The particular appeal of Southern literature is its attentiveness to this flaw in man, as opposed to a large portion of the literature proceeding from the North, which tried to create its stories around an unfallen man. As Alan pointed out last night in his excellent talk, there is a consciousness that comes through in Southern literature and Southern music of man as creation. He knows that he is not the creator. He knows that he is fallen and that there is some divinity towards which he is striving. The Northern Temperament, which proceeds largely from the Puritan background, and has this idea of the United States as the new Eden, manifest destiny, man is the new Adam, who had not fallen. That literature can't speak about a flaw in man. They can't afford to speak about a flaw in man if man is the new Adam. And of course, if you're going to hold yourself so highly, there's also no question of self-deprecation. So that literature is generally devoid of humor as well, but that's the subject for another talk. This acceptance of flawed nature that is so clearly the subject of much of Southern literature is partially why it appeals to such a large audience, including one of my favorites, and I beg you to forgive my Northern taste, Alan, Bruce Springsteen. Springsteen was interviewed by the New York Times about his literary influences, and he was asked which book he felt had the most influence on his writing and on his life. And he replied, Flannery O'Connor's short stories. He said, and I quote, "You could feel within them the unknowability of God, the intangible mysteries of life that confounded her characters, and which I find by my side every day. They continued the dark gothicness of my childhood, and yet made me feel fortunate to sit at the center of this black, swirling puzzle, stars reeling overhead, the earth barely beneath us." So he responds to that recognition of original sin in her stories, which I feel is indicative of or representative of all Southern literature. Now, Professor Wilson let the cat out of the bag, but as you now know, I am from Philadelphia. I am not from the South. And I have no more claim to love Southern literature than any Yankee. I have more in common with Bruce Springsteen than I do with Miss Flannery O'Connor. But I have the same claim to love it as Bruce Springsteen does, and that we share with every member of mankind. My talk is not going to be about how one should study Southern literature because you need to preserve Southern tradition or preserve Southern identity, but that we should read and study Southern literature to preserve the traditions of mankind and uphold our human identity. My ancestors were eating potatoes in Ireland, or rather, not eating potatoes in Ireland, by the time the war between the states had commenced, or as I've heard it referred to in Charleston, the recent unpleasantness. Which is perhaps why I've decided to approach the distinctness of Southern literature through a comparison to the great Irish author James Joyce. Now, I am not going to try to appropriate the Southern masters for the Irish, as the Irish are wont to do. During the Irish literary revival, William Butler Yeats tried to claim Homer for the Irish by saying that the ancient Greeks proceeded from a more ancient Celtic tribe. So technically, the Odyssey is a seminal work of Irish literature. And I experienced this appropriation on a personal level. Once again, Alan, I keep referring to your wonderful talk last night. When I was in Ireland, I experienced the same thing that you did, hearing all of the American music coming out of the different pubs. And I had a conversation with one gentleman, one musician, about the fact that they didn't play any Irish music. And he said, "Faith, darling, we played all Irish music. Didn't you know Tom Petty's from County Donegal?" So I'm not going to appropriate the South for Ireland. I'm starting with Joyce because I think the distinctness of Southern literature comes out most clearly in comparison with other literature. And Joyce is considered the father of modernism and a major influence on Faulkner, who I take up as a representative of what sets Southern literature apart. Despite the quickness of critics to put these two authors in the same category, their aesthetics and how each defines man's proper course of action in his struggle against his nature are vastly different. And it is the substance of this difference that really illuminates the particular character of this Southern literary ethos. Before getting into the literature of both of these authors, it's important to understand the type of background that's producing their writing. They're writing in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, which was shifting emphasis off the individual, leaving him in confusion as to his purpose and place in society. Joyce and Faulkner articulate their subjects with a similar technique and language, but a key difference has been noted by critics and anyone that's read them, that Joyce is essentially a comedian. He doesn't have a sense of the tragic. His stories end happily, and he thinks that man, whether he's destined to some further end, can have a happy ending to his life. And this partially stems from his lack of a moral code or a moral imperative that you can see in his personal life. Faulkner, in contrast, writes to grieve over universal bones. Another quote from his prize acceptance speech. Camus spoke of him as holding the keys to ancient tragedy. And the authors themselves are self-aware of this, and they identify themselves as comedian in Joyce's case and tragedian in Faulkner's case. Joyce wishes the focus of his work to be the great comedy in which we all share. And he says about Ulysses that there is not one single serious line in it. In contrast, Faulkner considered all of his works to be about the tragedy of humanity. When a man learns to read, he said in an interview, he learns of the tragedy or despair of his own kind, which he himself may suffer. And in an interview about a quarter of a century later, he said he considered life basically a tragedy, but that man's immortality is that he's faced with a tragedy which he can't beat, and he still tries to do something with it. So Faulkner's idea of tragedy is not a nihilist view of tragedy. He does believe that there is still a point to life and living, that he can't beat it, but he still tries to do something with it, and in this lies his immortality. But despite these immediate dissimilarities, critics were quick to make connections between Ulysses, which was published in 1918, and The Sound and the Fury, namely because of the use of the stream of consciousness technique that we see in Ulysses, but also in the beginning of The Sound and the Fury. And because Joyce had pioneered this technique, any use of stream of consciousness was sort of automatically considered, if you write with stream of consciousness, you've been reading Joyce. It's a Joycean influence. When The Sound and the Fury came out, critics said things like, Faulkner has the Joycean method of discontinuity. He has a manner that owes much to James Joyce. It's a Joycean narrative. He's eschewing punctuation in a Joycean sense. Now, if anybody knows stories of Faulkner, you would not be surprised that he didn't respond happily to these indications that he owed his genius to another author. And in an interview, he claimed that he had never read Ulysses. Now, there's a story from Estelle Faulkner which seems to contradict that. She says that when they were first married in 1928, Faulkner began what he termed my education, except she didn't call him Faulkner. She called him Bill, probably. He gave me James Joyce's Ulysses to read. I didn't understand it. He told me to read it again. I did, and understood what Mr. Joyce was writing about. Now, this story seems to indicate that Faulkner had read Ulysses and was familiar with it, although I find it highly improbable that Mrs. Faulkner not only read Ulysses, but read it twice, because I don't think they had abridged versions back then, and that's quite an accomplishment if she was able to do that. But regardless of whether Faulkner was reading Joyce or whether, as he said, there was just some sort of pollen in the air that contributed to them both having this same style, whether it was the influence of the Industrial Revolution or the history that was going on at the time, it is true that they are very similar. They use similar literary techniques, and the language that they use is very difficult sometimes to read, and that you have to work to get the metaphor, to create that world of the text that the language is creating. A friend of mine described reading The Sound and the Fury as hugging a cactus for 340 pages. So even more than the universal upheaval and threat to the individual caused by the industrial age, Faulkner and Joyce share in their regional backgrounds. They're caught up in the particular constraints on the individual presented by these regions, Ireland and the South. Starting with Joyce, perhaps no other country posed a greater threat to the writer as individual than Ireland in Joyce's time. The Irish literary revival, spearheaded by William Butler Yeats, sought to establish a national identity that was firmly rooted in classical tradition and the glories of the past. This, coupled with the demands of the religious and political ideologies of Irish society that precluded individualism, contributed the image for Joyce of Dublin as the center of paralysis. He considered that the town that he wrote about and lived in as the center of paralysis. And it motivated him to voluntarily exile himself from the city that he loved. He spent most of his life in Switzerland and Paris, writing, of course, all about Dublin, but not in Dublin. He elaborates in a lecture given at Trieste in 1907. The Irishman, finding himself in another environment outside Ireland, very often knows how to make his worth felt. The economic and intellectual conditions of his homeland do not permit the individual to develop. The spirit of the country has been weakened by centuries of useless struggle and broken treaties. Individual initiative has been paralyzed by the influence and admonitions of the church, while the body has been shackled by peelers, duty officers, and soldiers. No self-respecting person wants to stay in Ireland. Instead, he will run from it, as if from a country that has been subjected to a visitation by an angry Jove. It's telling that the hero that Joyce chose to create for Ulysses, probably his most enduring character with the exception of Stephen Dedalus, who is the character in Portrait of the Artist, is in exile. He's in exile from Ireland, from religion, from his own marital bed. He is the one who will get by because he is not affected by the stifling traditions of the city of Dublin. His name is Leopold Bloom, and he is a Jew. His idea of nationality is the one that Joyce wants to hold up for approval. For Bloom, nationality is the same people living in the same place. That is his definition of a nation. And it's worth noting that his definition of a nation has nothing to do with tradition or the past. It's completely rooted in the present. These people that are here in this time, in this place, are the nation. Joyce doesn't have the means that Bloom does, the natural means. He's raised Catholic. He's born in Dublin. He has family in Dublin. He doesn't have the means of exile or alienation that Bloom does. Bloom is able to live in Dublin but still be in exile. Joyce has to physically exile himself from the city. But the exile doesn't extend to his work, as I mentioned before. All of his writings are about Dublin. He has to write about Ireland because Ireland is what he knows. And a writer's purpose is to describe the life of his day, in his words. I chose Dublin because it is the focal point of the Ireland of today. Its heartbeat, you may say. And to ignore that would be affectation. It is also particularly useful for his ultimate goal, to show that man is happiest when he separates himself from any burdens of the past and lives only in his present. For Ireland is nothing if not haunted by its past. So that's something to keep in mind as I continue to read, and I'm getting into Faulkner, getting into the southern part of this, that he does not see happiness as being constituted by any sort of relationship with the past. Or any type of moral imperative. Faulkner's South was similarly a country haunted by the past and traditional social structures, and therefore an ideal stage for the drama of the individual struggling to assert himself. While Joyce grew up in the backlash of the political upheavals taking place in Ireland at the close of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, think of the Easter Rebellion, the Easter Uprising, Faulkner also lived through the repercussions of unrest and defeat, a South still recovering from the evils of the war between the states and the failure of Reconstruction. Added to this was the tenuous relationship between the aristocratic agrarian Old South, with her antiquated and slightly ridiculous code of chivalric honor, and the materialist industrialist New South, striving to assimilate as nearly as possible to a northern sensibility. And over the whole country lay the pall of the continuing consequences of slavery and the repercussions of defeat. I think of the story of Robert E. Lee coming back to his home in Arlington to find that his wife's rose garden and the remainder of his property was now a graveyard. That's a literal example of what was happening theoretically across the South. Like Joyce, Faulkner agreed that the writer's duty was to write about what was familiar to him. And for this reason, nearly all of his novels and short stories are written about his own part of the world, which he recreated as the town of Jefferson in the fictional Yoknapatawpha County. He said, quote, I wrote about American Mississippi simply because that is what I know best, stating that nobody should turn his back on his own tradition, his own language, his own culture, to assume a foreign one. Now, compare that with what Joyce says. No self-respecting person wants to stay in Ireland. Instead, he will run from it. The economic and intellectual conditions of his homeland do not permit the individual to develop. Faulkner is almost presenting a challenge to him. Nobody should turn his back on his own tradition, his own language, his own culture, to assume a foreign one. So Faulkner's connection to the South doesn't directly parallel Joyce's tortured relationship with Ireland. Most clearly in the fact that Faulkner remained in the South for his entire life, with the exception of occasional lecture tours and time spent in Hollywood. He was happy to be thought a provincial, and in fact, he often encouraged this impression, saying things like, I'm just a farmer who likes to tell stories. While Faulkner's relationship to the South was not entirely free from a feeling of constriction or tension, he did not reject out of hand the paralyzing nets of his own culture, that is, the honor-shame code of the Old South, the things that he inherited, as did Joyce. Instead, there was a certain respect for Faulkner in the way such archaic traditions empowered man in his struggle to endure and prevail in a modern age. And this is where the division between the authors really starts to manifest itself. And I believe it mirrors the differences between modernist literature and Southern literature. Faulkner's belief is that man cannot walk away from his past, that, quote, man is the sum of his past experiences, Was doesn't exist, it always is. The past is never dead, hell, it ain't even past. And that's from Requiem for a Nun. That is to say, man is fallen, and as a result will always be in constant conflict with himself, his nature, and his community. But nobody should turn his back on his own tradition. Joyce, in contrast, believes that man's happiness lies in the present, and that he's capable of separating himself from the restrictions of the past, an opinion that is reflected in his novels. Commenting on the structure of Ulysses, he says, "There is no past, no future, everything flows in an eternal present," which then brings up the idea or the technique of stream of consciousness again, and the quickness that the critics had to associate Joyce and Faulkner because of stream of consciousness. But you can start to see the differences in how they used it. Joyce wanted to use stream of consciousness because he believed that life moved in the present. There is no future, there is no past, everything flows in an eternal present. But for Faulkner, stream of consciousness was one way to try to tell a story. Although, as he said about The Sound and the Fury, that was a novel that he tried to tell the same story 4 different times and failed each time. The reason he uses stream of consciousness is to show where there are flaws in living in an eternal present or an eternal past, as he shows. So they really are using the same technique for entirely different reasons. For Joyce, it's not man's fall that creates the obstacles to his goal of happiness. It is the tyranny of social constructs. Man is in conflict only with the artificial restrictions imposed upon him by his environment. Faulkner, in contrast, considers man to be living in a fallen world, heir to original sin and likewise bound by a code of morality. He says man comes from God. Man is important because he possesses a moral sense. But the clearest way to determine how each author perceives man to resolve or endure the struggle of his nature is to read their literature, clearly. There are 2 ways in which Joyce demonstrates man to be capable of resolving his struggle, or which he believes man is capable of resolving this struggle. His hero, as I mentioned before, is Leopold Bloom, the protagonist of Ulysses. He's not a conventional hero. He's fleshly, he's crude, he has no heir, he's the husband of an adulterous wife, and everybody knows about it. He's the subject of ridicule. But neither was his literary predecessor a hero in the conventional sense. You read the Iliad, and Odysseus does not show up very often in the Iliad, and when he does, it's not in a very flattering light. He's caught running away from the battle at one point. He's not a hero for a battle. He is the hero because he's crafty and wily, and he can avoid the obstacles. His heroism or admirability rests in his sticking it out, making use of his craftiness to survive the battle and return back home, eventually, when he gets there. And part of his sticking it out means being a no man or a nobody. So there is an episode in the Odyssey where he is entrapped in a cave by the Cyclops, and in the process of escaping, the Cyclops asks him what his name is, and he says, "I am nobody," or "I am no one." And as he escapes, the Cyclops is shouting for help to his fellows, and they say, "Who did this to you?" And he said, "Nobody did it to me." And of course they all laugh, and Odysseus escapes. And that's telling. He escapes because he has no set identity. This lack of identity or feeling of exile, distance from the community, is exactly why Bloom is able to end his day happily. The end of Bloom's Day, as they call it in Ireland now, in June. The very end of the book, the last word is yes. It's a comedy. It's a happy ending. But throughout his day, he's coming to terms with various obstacles tied up with identity. Irish identity, religious identity, familial identity, and ultimately it's not in his conquering of society, but rather his escape from its demands that constitutes its victory. His triumph comes through a certain flexibility and accommodating character that is the real test of excellence in modernity. The task for him is only to reach Ithaca at the end of the day, and he will do so alone. This attitude towards exile was reflected in Joyce's actual life, as I mentioned before. Bloom is a natural exile because of his Jewishness, his multiple religions. He starts out Jewish and then he converts to Protestantism and then he's Catholic, but he doesn't go to Mass. So he doesn't really have a fixed identity. So as I said before, he can live in Dublin but not be tied down by those restrictions, whereas Joyce has to physically remove himself. And when we look at many American authors, the Lost Generation, Hemingway, Dorothy Parker, those authors were also writing from Europe. It's not a coincidence that the great Southern authors that we can think of all lived in one place. They stayed home. Sherwood Anderson cannot be separated from New Orleans. Flannery O'Connor from Milledgeville, Georgia. Faulkner from Oxford. Compare Faulkner's treatment of an exile from the community. Joe Christmas, one of his great characters, one of the main characters in Light in August, is most similar to Bloom's nobody or no man. An orphan, he is the son of a white woman and a man of unclear race, Mexican, black. The color isn't important. What's important is that he is of ambiguous race. He doesn't know who he is. And in fact, Faulkner says that that is his tragedy in a conversation with UVA students. Joe Christmas's tragedy is that he doesn't know who he is. His actions throughout the story are driven by this desperate need to find an identity. And when a prostitute that he sleeps with implies that his identity has no meaning for her, I don't care if you're black or white, I just slept with an Italian, it doesn't matter. He attacks her because he's so angry that she doesn't care. He can't endure the idea of being in exile from the community. His alienation and exile from both the white and black communities was not a blessing for him, or a way to avoid the struggle involved with being a part of the brotherhood of mankind. It was a strain that eventually led to his madness, murder, him murdering someone else, and then his own death. But I mentioned two ways in which the modernist Joyce considers man capable of resolving his struggle. So the first being exile, voluntary exile, or just alienation from a community, distance from a community, is one way that he thinks that man can be happy. The second is a complete exorcism and rejection of the past. Bloom is only able to return home to his bed when he has forsaken the memory of his dead son, expunged it from his mind, and mentally faced and dismissed the string of lovers that he knows his wife has been sleeping with, and forgetting the memories that he has of his wife, forgetting the way things used to be and accepting that this is the present and this is how I should live. And it doesn't matter what happens tomorrow, I'm going to be happy with what I have today. I've already mentioned Faulkner's views of the past. It's not even past. But that's not to say that he believes that man should live entirely within the past. And I think that Quentin Thompson is a good example of this. Quentin Thompson from Absalom, but more notably from The Sound and the Fury, or more recognizably from The Sound and the Fury, is a character that is caught up in the past. And in the same way that Ulysses, Homer can be helpful in understanding Bloom's identity or Bloom's character, the literary allusions in the title, The Sound and the Fury, offer clues to the conduct of the characters in the novel. The title comes from a speech by Macbeth. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. In Macbeth's mind, there is no point to telling stories. It will not give man the means to make sense of his life. Macbeth's thoughts are echoed by Daddy Compson, Quentin's father. No battle is ever won, he said. They are not even fought. The field only reveals to men his folly and despair, and victory is an illusion of philosophers and fools. These words are recalled by Quentin on the morning of the day that he will jump from Anderson Bridge into the Charles River to drown in the odor of honeysuckle. Daddy Compson's vision of life portrays a type of despair that is deprived of even the possibility of tragedy. Tragedy implies the fall, and implicit in the idea of the fall is some type of redemption or height, consequently a moral standard for living. But in Daddy Compson's world vision, Christ is ticked away by tiny wheels, and there's no point in committing suicide because there is no moral hierarchy, just as there is no point in defending innocence because, as he says, virginity is just words. And I should take a brief moment to summarize the plot of The Sound and the Fury, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, that there are 4 sections in the novel, and each is trying to tell the story of Caddy Compson, who is the sister in the family. And the 3 brothers each try to tell her story, and then the narrator steps in the 4th section to try to tell her story. And she grows up and she finds a lover and gets pregnant out of wedlock. Then she marries another man, and she leaves him, or he leaves her. We don't ever see Caddy in the novel, but we can put together her story from the 3 brothers and the narrator at the end. So, just to give you the background before I get more into it. Insofar as Faulkner's heroes are those who are able to endure, as he talks about, Quentin cannot be called a hero. He is a suicide. He doesn't endure. The will to endure, as Faulkner writes in The Unvanquished, is a sardonic and even humorous declining of self-delusion. But Quentin cannot get out of his delusion. He has created a narrative in his head to make sense of his sister Caddy's loss of innocence and in a certain respect sublimate his own guilt for failing to protect her honor as a brother ought. And this is what ultimately leads him to suicide. He sees continuance of life in a world as tacit agreement to Daddy Compson's meaningless universe, a universe in which the Southern code which has determined his course of action has no basis in reality. In order to abandon his delusion, he must reconcile the past with his present. He has to bring the past into the present. But his inability to do so is marked by his inability to finish a story. Over the course of the day, he's constantly trying to tell a story, but he can never get to the end because he keeps being brought back to dreams of his sister and what's happened. But we never actually hear from Quentin's perspective where Caddy is in her present circumstances because he's never able to think about her in the present. It's always in the past. Faulkner's trying to demonstrate a universal truth through Quentin, that is, the ineluctable force of the past upon mankind, and his struggle and often failure to make meaning of it in his reality, without, as Daddy Compson does, dismissing it altogether as a social construct. Quentin wants to reestablish somehow the innocence of his sister, and therefore restore the honor of his family. And this comes from his notion of honor that Quentin has inherited along with his last name. The idea that a Southerner is this type of person and not that type of person. The book is filled with references to what a Southerner should be or what I think a Southerner ought to do. No Compson ever disappoints a lady. In the South, you are ashamed of being a virgin. I used to think that a Southerner always had to be conscious of Negroes. I thought that a Northerner would expect him to. He has an idea of what it means to be Southern that he's stuck with. And his sense of otherness or separateness is enforced by the Southern mother of one of his classmates, who approves of Quentin because at least he revealed a blundering sense of noblesse oblige by getting himself born below the Mason-Dixon line. Quentin puts on this coat of honor like some ancient suit of mail, and it is equally unwieldy and impractical for a modern temper. And Quentin's roommate at Harvard, Shreve, who is Canadian, irks Quentin when he calls him the young Lochinvar out of the West. Quentin says, I am not from the West, I'm from the South. And to Shreve, it's all the same. You're from the southern part of the country instead of the western part of the country. But it's indicative of the way that the modern world, if Shreve represents the modern world, views Quentin and his idea of the South as this defining ideology. Shreve's perspective is echoed or seen also in Dalton Ames's view. And Dalton Ames is Caddie's lover. And Quentin confronts him. And he recollects this confrontation on the day that is recounted in the book. And as he recollects this confrontation, the reader feels as if they are privy to a melodrama. At any time, there might be a gauntlet thrown down and plans set for a duel at dawn. Quentin says, "I heard myself saying I'll give you until sundown to leave town." Ames responds, "Listen, it's no good taking it so hard. It's not your fault, kid. It would have been some other fellow." Each of these encounters highlight Quentin's tragedy, that he is attempting to make sense of his life solely through a code which does not translate to a modern sensibility. He hasn't discovered a way to reconcile it with a modern sensibility. Not that he has to throw it all out, but that he needs to bring it into the present. That's why he takes his life, because he refuses to live in Daddy Compson's nihilist universe. He doesn't realize that there is a way to endure and even prevail without abandoning this moral code and joining the Daltons and the Daddies. Quentin, in taking his life, is taking a stand for a moral universe, a possibility of redemption, and in this action he does have a tragic heroism. He may lose the battle, but he has fought. Faulkner's true attitude to the past, I believe, can best be seen in Dilsey, who appears in the 4th section. She's the black mammy who holds together the Compson family. Her section alone encompasses man's reality as one which must reconcile the past with the present in order to move into the future. A beautiful analogy of this occurs in the church service that is recounted in the 4th section. It's Easter Sunday, but because the servants are only allowed to take one day off, the entire Triduum is celebrated in a single service. So the scene starts with Good Friday. We see the imagery of the blood of the Lamb and the interconnectedness of the past, present, and future reflected in the despair, death, and redemption and resurrection of Christ comes forth in startling clarity. Dilsey, of all of the characters in the story, is the one that, according to Faulkner, endures. While critics want to place Faulkner and his Southern contemporaries in the same movement with Joyce and the modernists, they are in fact doing something very different. Joyce is offering a method of avoiding the struggle. Faulkner's narrative does not give man that option. An attempt to escape the inheritance of man will only lead to madness or to the death of his soul. And I believe that this is reflected in the novels of his Southern contemporaries. He does show, and O'Connor shows, and Percy and the rest, how the tragedy of life can be resolved triumphantly, because tragedy allows for the possibility of redemption. And in the tragedy of life, therefore, as Faulkner says, man will not only endure, he will prevail.